Hello and welcome to a special one-off Cluster API meeting discussing the load balancer provider proposal. Um, just a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted up to YouTube afterwards, and that we abide by the Kubernetes community code of conduct. So in general, please be excellent to one another. Picking up from where we left off, the action items that we had, Moshe provided the details around his ideas for a service implementation. Andy, Nadir, and myself were supposed to work on a potential alternative implementation that wouldn't necessarily be blocked on upstream service or service v2 features. I know I didn't get time last week to do that. I assume we were all kind of distracted by the events of last week. So I think we'll have to carry that over until next week. We did get a lot of the use cases and kind of user stories filled out, at least for AWS, vSphere, the Packet, now Equinix Metal provider. And we do have the Metal 3 ones. I did reach out to the OpenStack Azure and DO folks and didn't really get any feedback there, but I don't really expect there will be too much differences from kind of the use cases that we provided anyway. Which kind of brings us back kind of the point that we were at last week. So, Yassine, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so regarding alternative implementation, so I tried to come up with I tried to see at least if the current solution would be easy to implement. The first thing that I saw with the current proposal that we have right now is that if you start from a kind/bootstrap cluster and you try to rely on this CPI, you eventually end up with a chicken and egg problem, because kind is all about Docker containers and the nodes aren't able to register. So like you're not even able to uh, create the kind cluster and have the kind node marked as ready. So I feel like that we have two paths. It's either this one, or maybe we can say that, okay, we're relying on, we still keep the machine service. We have a selector on the machines, so we're able to, select CAPI-based machines and get their IPs. We're able, through the selector, we're able to specify ports and so on. So we're able to abstract the way that we want to, the fact that we want to create a load balancer and which backend we want. The only thing that would be left is to actually enable providers, or at least will need providers to build, or at least provide two images, the one with the usual controller manager and the one for the load balancer controllers, so that we're able, so that other providers are able to pick and choose between the implementations. If we don't have that, then reusing what we have on the providers would be much harder, because each provider would have to build the bits on their own and so on.
Isn't that the route that the cloud providers are going anyway? So I know the AWS load balancer providers is out of the cloud provider, or the newer one is. I know the NSXT provider is in the cloud provider. But I also am not sure why that couldn't be used for why that couldn't be deployed off the client. So just because I I can't attach storage to my Kind cluster doesn't mean I can't use my Kind cluster with a vSphere provider to orchestrate an NSXT environment. So I don't know if that
you would still need because the CPI isn't relying only on storage or load balancers. The main issue I see is with node identity, because you would need the provider ID. The node object wouldn't reflect the VM where Kind is running. So if you have
so if your controller is started with cloud provider not equal external, so you don't start it with a cloud provider, and then you run your cloud provider, your nodes are not going to be cloud provider enabled, but everything else that is running in the cloud provider should run. So your node reconcile loops will fail, but there's no reason why your load balancer reconcile loops shouldn't.
So in-tree is still going away. That's going to be my last comment, and then I'm going to hand out to Nadir. In-tree cloud provider are going away. Andrew filed for an exception for the kubelet bits that are still missing for 120. So the 121 timeline seems like to be still holding. So I wouldn't want to rely on something that would be deprecated and eventually.
So I'm not talking about the in-tree provider, but the way in which you configure the out-of-tree provider is still by running controller or cloud provider equals external. So if you don't turn on an external cloud provider and you provision Kind as is, the nodes will come up fine in Kind. You deploy your cloud provider, and you're going to have a cluster that has nodes that are not a cloud provider enabled, and a cluster that is not cloud provider enabled, but that shouldn't stop your cloud provider controller from actually running. Yes, the reconcile loops that deal with the nodes will fail because they're not nodes that have been brought up for external cloud provider, but your other control loops for the load balancers should still work. If that makes sense.
I'm going to hand out to Nadir, then I'm going to answer this one.
Okay.
Yes, maybe someone's already covered this, but my bigger issue with this after sort of about 5 minutes after our last meeting was the cloud provider contract is not really strong enough around running outside of the cluster. And in particular, if we're looking at public clouds, it also applies to vSphere, is what environment is it running in, right? So what, for AWS concretely, what AWS account, what VPC, what subnet should I be provisioning this load balancer in? There's no way of explicitly targeting that. What you would have to do for the AWS provider is to run a separate instance of that CPI with a bunch of credentials, make sure the resources are created to the cloud provider's liking in a very specific manner as far as tags go. Now, we've had a multi-tenancy model for Cluster API provider AWS, which kind of acted a bit like that in the sense that you would create a new separate namespaces and run an instance of Kappa in each of those namespaces. Unfortunately, well, in practice, no one's been able to set that up correctly because the UX is horrendous in terms of like explicitly configuring some AWS credentials and making sure it goes into the right place. And we are moving much more to an explicit interface where you are able to specify which AWS account I want to provision a cluster into. And that model is completely incompatible with the CPI. So we are relying on, if we go along the CPI route, we're relying on a contract which is not well defined as far as what Cluster API providers want to do.
So I want to clarify that we're not relying on CPI per se. We're relying on load balancing implementations. So if you take AWS, for example, the latest generation load balancer for AWS is not provided in the CPI. That's an external controller that you run. And yes, that external controller today doesn't handle multi-count very well, but there's no reason why that controller can't be made multi-count aware by having specific subnet groups, VPCs, and whatever else needs to happen to provision a load balancer be specified as parameters to that controller. So it's not that we're cloud provider, it's just that today many of the cloud providers bundle a load balancer provider, but that's not, it doesn't need to be the case. So
Yassine?
KubeVip would be another one. So if you're running KubeVip on bare metal, then you can run a KubeVip load balancer plus a bare metal cloud provider, and those two things don't have to compete with each other.
Yassine was next.
Yeah, so the fact is that like today, if we think about the implementations in the provider we have, most of them are bundled into the CPI. That's the fact. If you take the vSphere one, if you take Azure, like AWS doesn't have even the out of tree support yet. So there's that, and so
hold on just 1 second. The AWS load balancer is 100% out of tree, as far as I know. The one that is recommended. Yes, the CPI isn't, perhaps not out of tree, but the load balancer is out of tree.
But yeah, like that's like my point is that we can't pick and choose and say sometimes like the user experience across providers wouldn't be ideal, because we need something that would be easy to reason about. Like today, users are mainly used into two modes. One that is out of tree, and the other one is the in tree. If we start mixing up, like say, okay, for AWS, we're gonna run the ALB provider. For Azure, we're gonna run the CPI. For vSphere, we're gonna run the CPI. That might create confusion for the user. And yeah, like that's a point. And like if we still say the CPI for Azure and vSphere, for example, when you start out of tree, you have an initialized change that is going to be stuck anyway to the node object. So your node would still be marked as like failing. So for at least for a kind cluster.
All right, let's go to Andy.
Yeah, I think that you have some really good ideas here, Moshe, but unfortunately, I think the timing is such that it's going to be much more of an uphill battle for us as a group to implement what you're proposing than to basically do our own data model, our own implementations of load balancers for all the different providers that are cluster API specific here. I mean, we could even go with a more generic model that keys off of endpoints if we want, but I think that the trying to use service type load balancer and use a load balancer implementation, be it coming from a CPI or a standalone thing, I think we're just not at a point where we can have that consistently work across all the different providers that we have right now. And I think that the chicken and egg problem, maybe we can solve it a little bit. I think the multi-tenancy issues, like we know that AWS doesn't have them solved right now for what we're trying to do with a single instance provisioning into multiple accounts. So again, I think you have great ideas, but I just think the timing is too early. And I think we need to go with a design that works with what we need to do today.
Moshe?
You're muted, I think.
Yeah, so what would be your proposed design then?
So it would be something we talked about a while ago, which looks very similar to what you have on paper, but instead of using instead of doing service type load balancer and relying on some controller like from the cloud provider or a standalone one, we would be providing the load balancer implementations from the various providers. So whether the data model is you have machine service and endpoints or some slight variation, like I don't think we need a service per se. I think we can get by with, call it machine service, call it machine load balancer. That would be one entity. We probably would want to have endpoints or something similar to endpoints that could keep track of which machines are in service for a machine-based load balancer or machine service at any given time. But I think the thing that actually goes out to vSphere or AWS or Azure or whatever and says, make a load balancer, that would be custom code that the various cluster API providers write. And I think we would probably follow a similar model to what we have today with object references. So you could have a machine load balancer type, and it could have an infrastructure reference that points to an AWS NLB load balancer or a vSphere NSXT load balancer or whatever. And the things would work together where we have the generic portion in cluster API core and the infrastructure specific portion in each infra provider.
Could you point that object ref to a normal service, a service of type load balancer if you so choose, from a cluster API perspective? So if we make the contract for machine load balancer the same as service, so it must return on status ingress host IP, then we can potentially support both.
I need some time to think about that. I don't know.
And then the second question I have is, will VMware commit to making an NSXT load balancer provider? Because this is kind of my issue, is that we don't have an NSXT provider today for VMware, or vSphere rather, with really none on the roadmap. And this, what you're proposing would require a custom NSXT load balancer that sits outside of the cloud provider that somebody's going to need to write, maintain, and have integration tested against every CAPI version and every Kubernetes version. So is VMware going to commit to that? So that's my question. Because so I know you're probably going to say you can't make that commitment, but this is kind of the problem, is what you're proposing is that everybody does it themselves, but we know that everybody doesn't do it themselves. That's kind of one of the issues.
So I wasn't going to say exactly that I can't make that commitment, but that I would go back and talk to folks and circle back later.
Yeah.
Yassine?
So it like for with the generic model and the reference that we have that we would have, technically, like cluster API would be mostly responsible for setting up the owner reference to manage, say, the deletion lifecycle and so on. But ultimately, like if you want to unblock things and you want to use a specific CPI implementation on your side, you can always do that if you have if you build your own controller / CRD for the infra implementation. I'm not saying that we're going to support it, for example, in CapV, but like that would be an option to, make it work for the use case that we want to support at least.
So I also think that there's a nuance here too, and if we reuse kind of an external service load balancer implementation, there's a much more involved compatibility matrix than we potentially have with having a separate kind of controller implementing this as well. If we do reuse the service type load balancer controller, we're looking at, which version of the controller is compatible with which version of cluster API, which is compatible with which version of Kubernetes you may be running on and things like that. Whereas I think with kind of the design that Andy's talked about, there's less of that because we already have a contract between providers and core cluster API, and we're not expected to support, say, like a V1 Alpha 3 cluster API controller with a V1 Alpha 4 provider controller, things like that. So I think having something specific to cluster API actually reduces that compatibility matrix quite a bit too.
So on that, I would actually disagree, because I think that the V1 service, by definition of being V1, that contract is very well defined. Any load balancer that wants to be implemented for pods must meet that contract. And as a V1 service, it's going to be tested across all the compatibility layers, and it's going to be tested across all the cloud providers and all the Kubernetes configurations. So you're already going to start with a compatibility matrix and a matrix that includes a lot of testing from a lot outside the cluster API. All cluster API needs to do is honor that same contract, and it gets all of that compatibility matrix that's already built into V1 service gets added onto cluster API. I don't see why you would need to test cluster API against every Kubernetes / cloud provider / load balance implementation. You'd need to test it against the V1 service contract. And then you make sure that your cloud providers provide a V1 service contract, and you test them against the V1 service contract. And that's already occurring all over the place. And we can build upon that rather than reinventing the wheel.
Nadir?
Yeah, so I think it's all very well saying, V1 a good contract, but I think the issue is we have additional requirements outside the service V1 specification. So there's probably a action item to start filling out those functional and non-functional requirements. And I think it will become pretty obvious that the service V1 contract is not really broad enough to cover the use cases that we're interested in dealing with. And then we don't gain, we actually lose out because it's not in the cloud provider implementation's interest to add tests for things which are outside of the service V1 specification. Whereas as a cluster API implementer, we're in control of those tests. Granted, we need to be a lot better in our E2E testing, etc. But we own those contracts. We can make guarantees around what the implementation should be, and we can enforce those testing. Whereas relying on service V1 when it doesn't actually meet our requirements, and then what we're actually relying on are sort of informal behavior, implementation details. It's pretty difficult. And from a project governance perspective, like it's going to be hard to get the CPIs interested in testing the features that we need because it's not in the spec, essentially.
But correct me if I'm wrong here, the machine load balancer type that we're going to be creating is not going to do any better than the service type. all of the features that you would need to be implemented on the specific infra provider. So you're talking about the same thing, really. The machine load CAPI core is going to test against a single reference implementation of the machine load balancer. And then every infra load balancer is going to have to create its own test and its own matrix and do all of that itself. So I'm still not seeing how that plays.
You see?
So to answer that question, like if we own the infra implementation, technically the cluster API providers / cluster API community can decide to extend the infrastructure types to enable some specific use cases. Whether if we go with the service, we would need to go to Lens to either change something to the core types or implement or change things at the CPI level. So yeah, like I feel like that if there are implementations that are available at the CPI level, but that aren't available at the CAPI level, we should be more pursuing the path of trying to externalize those rather than like going into the CPI to get them.
Hey, y'all, I got to run. So see you all next time. Thanks.
Cheers. So I agree with Andy that we write up another proposal, and then we maybe just handle each of these concerns on both proposals in writing, I think, and then have another discussion next week, and maybe a follow-up at the main CAPI meeting. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Oh, sorry, Yassine.
Oh no, we can start opening another document to outline and the alternative proposal, and then
It doesn't need to be another document. It can be in the same document, just have proposal number 1 and proposal number 2. And at some point, one of the proposals will go away. We implement both, or we implement one.
yeah, that sounds good. Let's start in the same document, and if we see that it's getting to like if we start seeing like that we have too much text there, we can split. But let's start in the same.
Yeah, I think rallying in the same document makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the things that we may be looking at is what do we do in the short term versus what do we do in the long term as well? Because there are a lot of potential issues that we have trying to rely on the same service implementations. And if we can enumerate those, we can look at what can we do to eliminate those problems upstream, and then potentially kind of work towards a longer term goal as well. So I don't necessarily think it's possibly one or the other. It could be this is what gets us to where we need to be in the short term versus where we would like to be in the long term.
100%.
Sounds good.
That makes sense. Yeah.
All right, great. So it sounds like I'll go ahead and reschedule another meeting for next week, and we can regroup then.
Cool.
Thank you all
Cool.
very
Cheers,
much.
everyone. Okay. Bye.
Have a nice day.